Jimmy, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to bring together three CTOs and former CTOs to discuss alignment between product and engineering. Let's just start with some introductions. Teresa, you're the CTO at Stack Overflow. Can you introduce yourself and tell us about your role there?
Yeah, I joined Stack Overflow back in January. Interesting time to be moving into a new leadership role right before the world turned upside down. And I have responsibility for the engineering organization, product, as well as community, being that we have one of the biggest technical communities on the planet. So it's been a lot of fun, and I have over 20 years of experience in the tech industry, starting at AOL long ago.
That's great. And I'm assuming a lot of people know Stack Overflow on here, but the quick 30-second explanation for those who may not.
Yeah, it's knowledge sharing for both the wider technology community, as well as a B2B product that is used by technology organizations within companies to sort of asynchronously share and build knowledge.
Fantastic. And Ian, welcome. Can you introduce yourself and your role, and tell us a little bit about Open Door?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ian Wong. I'm one of the co-founders of Open Door, and I serve as a CTO here. I currently oversee engineering, data science, and our pricing function. Before Open Door, I was an early employee at Square, where I got my start in kind of the Silicon Valley and the startup scene. Open Door. So we are a technology real estate company, and our goal is to make buying and selling, and over time living in a home 100 times easier than it exists today. So we're very focused on helping people, give them more power to move.
That's great. And then for myself, I'm going to be the moderator as well as a panelist here. And I'm Kathy Polinsky. I'm the former CTO of Stitch Fix, which is an online personal styling service. At Stitch Fix, I ran and was responsible for engineering, product, and IT. But before Stitch Fix, I was at Salesforce for 7 years during massive growth, as well as worked in engineering and engine management roles at Amazon, Oracle, and Yahoo. I think it's, just given the scope of the different companies we've worked, we've probably seen a lot of different relationships between product and engineering. And I'm just curious, Ian, what have you seen makes for a really good partnership between product engineering, and where have you seen it fail?
Yeah, I think where it works, where it fails is easy. Where it fails is where products and engineers do not trust one another. When, for instance, engineers or product folks are very obsessed with solutions rather than problems. And also when folks aren't rigorous about actually the cadences and the rituals and rely on intentions rather than mechanisms. And there are many cases where, if you don't have trust, customer obsession, and the rituals correct, that things would really fall apart.
Yeah. What about you, Teresa?
I agree with the trust. I think we've all probably seen a lot of ones where it doesn't work, and then we've sort of made learnings on that and tried to do pattern recognition. I think for me, what I'm looking for is that there's always going to be tension between product and engineering, and it's how do you make it healthy, productive tension, where you end up with a solution, as Ian said, you come together and end up with a solution that's actually better than if it came from one of those teams, and so that they both have a seat at the table. I think what you often see where it fails is there's a power imbalance. Mm-hmm. Somebody's putting forth a roadmap, somebody's putting forth a solution, like Ian said, and the other team is then sort of on the back foot responding to it, right, as opposed to coming together and building it together.
Yeah, I haven't always seen tension. I know that there can be a push-pull on these things, but I often think about things as like 2 in a box or 3 in a box if you add data science and or different roles. And have you used that type of language and feel like that helps the power dynamic in any way?
Yeah, definitely. I think at Open Door, we call our groups ePods. So they're engineering, product, operations, because we're a pretty operationally intensive company. And D stands for design or data science, depending on which group it is. And actually, it's really important to have a group be named an ePod for us, because it signifies that, hey, each group has to have an eng leader, product leader, et cetera, and that the roadmap and the outcomes of those groups are co-owned by leaders from these different functions.
Yeah, makes sense. I think it's really interesting that all of us come from an engineering background, but have had responsibility over engineering and product. Teresa, what did you have to learn to be able to manage both? Was it a difficult or an easy transition?
I think it was a natural progression for me. As Ian said before, I was always interested in like, what is the problem we're solving for users? I enjoy architecting the solution too, but I always really wanted to understand what the underlying problem was to make sure we actually solved it. So, and I think the other thing is coming from engineering, it's easier when it's a slightly more technical, tool, user set or whatnot for you to understand that domain. There's some specific domains where I know that I would not be great at leading product and engineering because the amount of domain knowledge I would need. But, especially somewhere like Stack Overflow, it really makes sense for me to be able to understand our users and our buyers because of my background.
Yeah. And Ian, you also had the difficult challenge of navigating that as well as being a co-founder. And what was it like to do that transition as a co-founder?
Yeah, I mean, as the co-founder, my job first and foremost is to help the company succeed. And so a lot of cases, my job is to actually hire myself out of a job. But where I can, I try and create value, with the roles or expertise that I can bring. I would say that in the early days, when the teams are very small, you kind of have to wear multiple hats. And so I think that applies to many, many small engineering teams where sometimes the EM or the tech lead is playing that product lead role. But what I found to be much more challenging is as the company scaled beyond just, a team of 4 to 10 engineers, when you start to oversee actually multiple engineering functions, you really have to actually have the craft of products or design come in and help the team accelerate their development. Mm-hmm. And for me, the hardest part is actually grokking design thinking, like really understanding user pain points, really understanding how do we actually articulate what the pains are, brainstorm around solutions, get aligned on the solutions.
Yeah.
You can read the process part, which is relatively straightforward, but there's real craft in actually coming up with that and getting alignment and solving for customer pain points.
Yeah. At Stitch Fix, we did a lot of design sprints to get that design thinking into the whole team and really made it a very collaborative process with business stakeholders, engineers, designers, and the like. And Teresa, you're nodding. Have you done similar things? Does that help?
Yeah, I've done them before. I think I spent 2 years at McKinsey New Ventures where we were constantly coming up with new products and we were doing concept sprints, which were sort of an iteration of a design sprint, 1 or 2 a month. And so to Ian's point, I got in that quickly and now like it's sort of ingrained in me. And I think it's super valuable. And to your point, Kathy, like bringing in like the stakeholders, bringing in all the folks that are going to be working on the team so they all understand the why, right? The what and the why. So as you then progress outside of the concept sprint, that foundation is built with all the players on the team that are going to be actually building this.
Absolutely. Spicy question. Have either of you been accused of playing favorites or valuing one function over the other? And how have you managed conflict disagreements on your teams?
Maybe I can start and Teresa can add on. It's funny because if you ask the engineers, they might say, hey, you're favoriting the product team. And if you ask the product team, it's vice versa. So the grass is always greener. And there are classic conflicts between the two groups, right? The product folks are rightly so always very focused on impact. And it's like, hey, why might we need to invest in this tech debt line item? Or engineers would be like, hey, we're really compromising on our ability to develop efficiently because we're not investing in X, Y, or Z. And the answer is usually somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I think what's really important is going back to the trust element, which we started talking about, and also having the right rituals. So at the basis of it is that the product leadership and the engineering leadership need to trust one another, right? And actually there's a lot of things that go into building trust, right? Like understanding how we can actually bank that social capital so that you all can deploy that in these tough moments where you have the debates, and also having the rituals around having retrospectives, planning processes where disagreements are in the open and you can really get into it with one another in a objective way.
Yeah, I love retrospectives for building trust and just giving this forum for people to air out the things that aren't working while still celebrating the things that are working. And Teresa, what about you? Anything that you see that generates more trust or use of retrospectives?
Yeah, I think I always say I spend a whole lot of my day dealing with building context and managing expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's one way that you build trust, right? And I think it's one way that you also help people feel empathy for the other stakeholders at the table, right? Is explaining, why we need to work within these constraints, why we need to, prioritize a certain amount of tech debt or tech investment, right? And helping everybody understand that. I think the other thing too is where I've challenged teams is to try and optimize, right? So instead of it being like, I come to the table with my list of priorities and I'm trying to get all of them in the order of my priorities on there. I think it's find out where you're doing it, because we're working on this feature or enhancement, right? There happens to be some fragile code there that everyone's afraid to touch. We may not have the test cases we want on it. The automation may not be where we want to. So finding ways, challenging them to find ways to be as efficient and find opportunistic areas where, because we work on one area, we actually can take something that would have been 8 weeks worth of work done independently and turn it into 4 or 5 weeks. And I feel like giving them that challenge as a group has really helped them find ways to optimize how much impact across the board they can deliver.
That's great. And I'm starting to see some questions in the Q&A. Please add questions if you're in the audience and upvote things. I saw one that was sprinkled in that I thought I could just have us answer now, which was related to different alignment of a public versus private company. And I actually didn't feel that there's a big difference between public and private companies. I felt that there's a big difference between alignment between product and engineering, whether you're working on an infrastructure type of project versus a enterprise product versus a consumer product. There's just a different way that product managers are interacting with the customers and how much interaction that the engineers can even have. And I don't know if you feel similarly of public versus private or different technology product features that you're working on and how that alignment changes.
I would agree with you, Kathy. I don't see a big difference between public versus private. It may be industry, like you said, to consumers versus to businesses, right? What the scale of your user group is, how hard it is to sort of feel like When I was at WebMD, I used to laugh. It was something like 98% of English-speaking people who were looking for health or wellness information came to us. Like, that was really hard to determine like who our user segments were sometimes. So I feel like that's a harder challenge than public versus private.
Ian?
Yeah, and I would agree with you, Kathy. I think the art typically ends up being, how do you align on, say, a consumer product versus a very data science capability focused team versus an enterprise team or an internal tools team? The processes that you would take might feel similar, but actually the end customer is very different. So how do you actually, on the consumer side, you might do design sprints where you actually talk to customers that are on the field, and you have to actually be very intentional about how you actually identify the pain points. Whereas the data science capability focused team, you might be very focused on actually a KPI, and that drives how you think about things. And you're looking at errors from your data set and kind of rinse and repeat in your ML algorithms versus internal tools, where for us, it's actually important for us when we were not in COVID for our engineers to fly to our local operational hubs and actually sit with them side by side and actually shadow them and be in their shoes for a few days. So the approach actually varies a lot, but I don't know about public versus private.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's get into tactics a little bit. What does your product roadmap process look like? How do you get alignment between the different functions when you're defining prioritization and roadmaps? Teresa, you want to start? Or go ahead, Ian, keep going.
No, Teresa, please go. Yeah.
Yeah. My goal is honestly, just like I'm always trying to push functionality as close to the user as I can, I try and push, the roadmap building process as close to the Scrum team who is living in there day in and day out, right? And, they have responsibility of their different ways that they collect user feedback. We've been building for our products user feedback matrices, talking about how do we get, qualitative and quantitative, how do we get what they think they're going to do versus what they're actually doing versus what they want to do. And so by pushing that down to the team, I've had really good success there because that's where I, as I mentioned before, find the opportunities, because, where there's commonalities and where we could be more efficient and in the roadmap and delivering value and impact, and really having those teams then come and present it. And yeah, as the chief product or technology officer, you might have to tweak it a bit, right? Enter in strategic things that maybe they don't know about or haven't thought about, or push them to be a little more ambitious in what they're trying to achieve. But if 80% of it came from the team, the sense of ownership is very strong and really helps with the accountability and responsibility to deliver this value and to try and also I challenge the team to come up with their timelines, right? I may pressure test it, but if once we agree to it, then because it's not me setting a timeline and them being defensive about it, right, and telling me all the reasons I'm wrong on the timeline, this way they suggest it, I pressure test it a bit, make sure they're not being too ambitious or too conservative. That's really the way I like to do it, and I feel like it's really been successful in that team filling that authority and then being able to be held accountable.
I love that. And I do think that you need this pairing of top down and bottoms up. So making sure that you're communicating out the vision of what the company or your division is responsible for and where you're going, but then allowing these teams to have bottoms up say into what they're working on and when it's going to be ready.
That's a good point, Kathy. Like you have to have those visions, pillars, themes, whatever already built so that it's not just completely greenfield, right? So I think that's a great point to have. You have to have that before you can let the teams loose.
Yeah. So when I was at Stitch Fix, there really wasn't a product organization, and I created a very lightweight, roadmap process where the teams presented out their quarterly plans. And it was the first time that they had actually done a job of like prioritizing the work that they were doing and thinking a little bit further ahead. And I'd say literally the first day that we did this, someone came up to me in the hall and said, "Kathy, we got a problem." Someone came to me about something that we had never thought of and presented. And I said, "Okay, well, bring up your list." And I said, "Is it more important than the first item? No. Is it more important than the second item? No. Is it more important than the third item? No." We got through the list, and I was like, "Well, there's your answer. Just go back to the person asking and saying, it's not you don't have the capacity. It's not a priority right now." And I think without having that, someone would have just gone and done the work, even though it wasn't adding a lot of value. And so I don't know, you think about like, what's the right amount of process to be able to have those conversations without too much process that it slows everything down?
It's tough because inevitably over the course of a quarter, fires happen, things change, and you have to be nimble. You can't be, super, just strict with the process because that's tail wagging the dog in many ways. And so we try to be very clear, I think, to what Teresa was saying, what the themes are. Like, what is the overarching customer problem or KPI that we're trying to improve or solve, and be flexible on the details. Now, we should have a plan. So we do have quarterly plans, and the way that we do that is very similar to what Teresa talked about. But we also have check-ins, either for most teams, at least on a monthly cadence, if not bi-weekly. So those are very natural points where, hey, this thing came up, should we reprioritize? And to your point, we would do, Kathy, with that exercise you just did, like, where does the stack rank against the top 10 things we need to do? That's a very natural point in time for us to reassess.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions here about tech debt. So Naveen asks, tech debt, how do you manage, especially with extremely small team trying to come out with an MVP? Mohit asks, when do you prioritize refactoring versus building new features? That's just a big part of navigating the roadmap process. And so how do you look at that folding in with all the product delivery needs?
I can start, and this is
go for it. It's a heavy topic, so that's really funny to talk about.
Yeah, there's full of landmines here. I think there is a question around early team versus late team, and I think that it's tough because, especially in early team, you really have to ask, what is a hypothesis the team is trying to set out to prove or disprove? And to what extent do you need to build for 10x or 100x when you don't even know if you have like 1x relative to what you are forecasting? And so it's almost like you want to have minimal viable architecture. Having said that, I'm not saying don't write tests, or I'm not saying don't cut all sorts of corners, but you have to scope the architecture in a way that makes sense for your business and what you're trying to validate or invalidate. And then at scale, I think there are mechanisms to kind of do this on an ongoing basis. You can allocate explicitly one out of your 3 OKRs or 10 or 20% of your engineering time explicitly to tech debt, and just have a handshake agreement with product, for instance. But there are many other methods of doing that.
Yeah, I would jump in there and say on the MVP, I think, when I was, at the McKinsey product incubator, we were kicking off MVPs like once or twice a month, right? And, one of the things I think we learned to do really well was to leave breadcrumbs, for when you built the MVP. To Ian's point, you have to be sort of ruthless when you're building an MVP, otherwise you'll never actually get the MVP built to actually test your hypothesis and see if you'll go to even 1x. But it's about leaving some breadcrumbs behind, because especially in an MVP, the folks who end up taking this over, the people who built it to begin with may not be there. So trying to leave some breadcrumbs is sort of like why we made these decisions, right? So it's not like we didn't think about this, we thought about this, but this is why we made the decision. Also, and here's about where we think this is going to go from being like something to think, remember, to something to think about, to something to be, on red alert for watching to happen. I think when it comes to the larger scale teams, I think there's sort of two types of tech debt, right? And so one is sort of in that backlog of that you can have prioritized, which is where you can look for opportunistic places when you're going in because of feature work and do that. And then I think there's ones where like it's a big looming cloud or shadow over the team, in which case, what you need to be able to do as an engineer is to articulate the risk and the benefit of investing, right? And I keep trying to use tech investment instead of tech debt, right? Because the minute you start building something, theoretically, you acquire tech debt. So it's instead like investing in the tech when it's the right time to invest in it. And I think being able to really help product management or the stakeholders understand like why this is the right time, what's going to happen, whether it could be we're going to get faster. This chunk of code, this feature needs to be refactored. And here's why. Every time we touch it, it takes us 3 times as long because it's hard to understand, it's fragile, right? So it could be things that are going to make us move faster in the future. It could be because, we're speeding towards a wall at which things are going to just start breaking and falling apart. And I think it's really important as an engineer to be able to articulate that in a way that the stakeholders and, the product side of the house can really understand and buy into.
Yeah.
I just want to build on that a little bit, because I think that's absolutely right. One of the really important pieces that we have started to introduce is how do we actually not just have a product roadmap, but also some notion of a technical roadmap, right? Like how do you actually treat technical projects that are substantive, for instance, moving to a service-oriented architecture as a first-class citizen in your product planning processes? And that requires the EMs or the tech leads to actually articulate, to Teresa's point, hey, what are the pain points? How do we actually scope this over maybe multiple quarters and be very clear about why this is beneficial for the company. And then once we have that roadmap and the set of design docs, we can actually then say, okay, how do we fit these big rocks into the planning process? But I think what's oftentimes tough is, especially in early teams, there's a vague notion that, wow, there's a lot of cruft in the code and I feel like I'm being slowed down, but really the pain points and the effects are not being clearly articulated, to Teresa's point.
Yeah, because if you don't take care of them, it's going to slow things down. Yeah.
What I was going to add, Ian, is what I've learned over time is, so like on all of our product lines, we have like 5 pillars. And one of those pillars is always grow and scale. And that could be technical investment, that could be security and compliance, that could be, automation, tooling, whatnot, right? And so I feel like I make that a product pillar. So it's not a separate roadmap. It's not it's just one stream in the roadmap, and the whole team feels accountable for all of those pillars.
That's interesting. I've gone back and forth on this. So sometimes I've had engineering roadmaps versus product roadmaps. I think that it's a concern if I don't see an engineering leader really building out a technical backlog of things that they need. But I've shifted more to having a consolidated roadmap of making sure that the engineering leads and leaders are advocating for the why of these features and understanding like we're doing this for performance, we're doing this for this impact on the customers, we're doing this to reduce bug counts. And yeah, do you see things on separate backlogs versus consolidated backlogs and pros and cons?
It's consolidated for us. The folks who are coming up with the technical roadmap are engineers and tech leads, but at the end of the day, you don't. I think the intention here is you don't want to create two sets of competing priorities necessarily. You want to have one cohesive team. So absolutely, we have one consolidated backlog.
Yeah. I have this little thing where I don't look at it per team, but because sometimes you're working on a new MVP or a new team, you don't have any technical investments that you need to make. But I kind of look across the team as like, what percentage of our time are we working on these technical investments and which ones are all product features? And if it starts to dip between, lower than 30 or 25%, like I'm starting to worry, are we not investing in the future enough? Are we creating too much debt? Do you have any spidey senses of when you got the balance wrong and where you might start to see problems?
I think for me, it goes as the percentage of sort of the tech investment, tech debt from in that MVP early stage teams is pretty close to zero because they're just building it for the first time. And then it's a progression. And when something hits sort of a maturity level, Kathy, I sort of assume a third-ish, right? In that like 25 to a third. Yeah. And, I spend a lot of time, explaining to CEOs or business stakeholders, like when it hits a certain maturity, you need to understand that about a third of the team's time is going to be whether it's bug fixes, whether it's, tech investment, scaling,
customers,
whatever, that's normal for this, just to keep that sort of keep the lights on, keep things being able to scale and meet business demand investment.
Yeah, and for me and Open Door, I think the North Star is always, how do we learn as quickly as we can? How do we iterate as quickly as we can? And so when you see a tech debt rears ugly head, that's when on-call load's very high, the architecture is inflexible, and you can't accommodate new product lines that you want to serve. So that's when it's really time to pay down tech debt.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ian. I think people will not think they have tech debt, right? Even the engineers may not think they have tech debt. But what I've had to point out sometimes is like, look at the operational or organizational overhead you have, because everyone's afraid to touch certain parts of, the monolith or the platform, right? And so they think it's working because they've sort of processed around it, but aren't aware of sort of that reduction in sort of like efficiency or how quickly teams can move or how flexible they can be.
Yeah. There's a question here. How do you handle the brilliant jerk in engineering? I'm sure we've all worked with one. And what are your thoughts of the importance of a strong work culture?
I can start. It's really tough because it happens, and oftentimes they are the toughest ones to work with because they are immensely talented. And I think as a manager, our goal is to always coach and identify how we can amplify the strengths of individuals while shock absorbing, or ideally coaching away the weaknesses. A lot of times these individuals may not be aware of the impact that they are having on their teammates. And it's not going to be one conversation. It's going to be a series of long conversations every single week, oftentimes multiple times a week, where, hey, when you did X, what do you think the effect of X was? Here's what actually we observed. How do we make an improvement? And it's constant coaching. Now, there does come a point in time where things don't work out, and
they don't want coaching.
Right, and coaching fails. There are a variety of reasons why things don't work out, and it's, from my experience, better to part ways if that's really what it comes down to. But ideally, there's tons of remediation and coaching that happens before you get to that point.
Yeah, I think you have to start at the top, Kathy, in the end, right? Like the top level technology leadership has to sort of say, this isn't okay, right? Because I think where I've seen people like that hang around and not get any feedback, it's because everyone, including leadership, is afraid of giving them that feedback, right? Whether of them leaving or getting upset or how much span of control or impact they have. And so I think you have to start at the top and say, this isn't okay. We aren't going to be willing to accept this. And I agree with Ian on the feedback, right? You know, when you did X, this is the impact that you have. And I'm going to assume best intent, and I'm going to help coach you. One of the things I focus on when I give feedback like this to folks is like, let's come up with a different way that you could have reacted to that situation or handled that situation. Because what I found is that, especially if people haven't ever received feedback or any strong feedback in this, it's just their normal operating mode. And so instead of spending time on the problem solving, like here's let's come up with 1 or 2 ways that you could handle this the next time this happens, proves much more valuable than just making them sort of feel bad for, the impact they didn't necessarily understand they're happening. I think the other thing I would say here for leaders or those developing into leadership, these folks, if it really is toxic and they aren't changing, it tends to be an iceberg where you're seeing 20% of the impact.
Yes.
And, when you're hesitant to make moves, you give them chance after chance after chance.
Yeah.
After they finally are removed or leave of their own accord, it turns out there was a whole lot of impact going on that you weren't even privy to.
Yeah.
And I think that makes you more confident and willing to step in earlier when you start to see behaviors happening because you've seen the long-term effects of that.
Yeah. And at Stitch Fix is the first company I worked at that kindness is a core value of the company that we talk about when we're hiring people and when we have people come in the door. And I think just stating the values up front and what you're going to accept and what not just actually changes the type of people who opt into your company, but also gives you language when you don't see it to say like, hey, that didn't show up as kind. You can all talk about how you can be better and support each other. I could talk about this topic for another hour. I'm sure all of you can too, but this was so delightful. I really enjoyed speaking with you today. We are out of time. Thank you all for your great questions in the audience, and hope you all enjoyed this as much as I did.
Thank you.
Thank you.